Thank you. Salam, everyone. Good to see you all. Thank you for joining. So, as a quick recap, we are in part 4, the last part of the course, and talking about consciousness and experience and developing our understanding of that so that we can add to our uh, understanding of God and the nature of God, and how we can uh, develop that relationship at a deeper level. So we began by starting with a scientific exploration, just like we did in parts 1, 2, and 3, and we looked at the brain because that's the part that we can identify as being closely connected to consciousness, but being something physical that we can experiment with and explore objectively. And we learned about how the brain works a little bit in some basic level. And then we started to think about, what it is that we can know about the world, how we get to know it. And I just pointed out the importance of recognizing that everything that we know about the world has to come to us through our minds, right? So we do not have direct access to the external world, what we think of as the external world, outside of our minds, right? Everything we know has to come through the mind. And that becomes a very important consideration when we think about what we know and the nature of reality. Okay, and we had some basic facts of experience. Basic facts, yes, of experience that we need to explain with any theory of reality. We're going to have to explain these 3 facts. What were the 3 facts? Fact number 1, that we seem to inhabit a shared world outside of our personal world, right? So we have a personal mind, what's going on inside my mind. And then when I look out, I see a world that I seem to share with you, and that we seem to agree on the broad characteristics of that world. Yeah, we all seem to agree what it looks like outside ourselves. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is that we don't seem to be able to change the outside world the way that we can change things within our own minds, right? I can change my thoughts. I can't just make things happen in the outside world just by thinking about it, right? So we cannot change the outside world through our own volition, through our own choice, right? So that was fact number 2. And then fact number 3 was that there is a very close connection or correlation between the brain and the mind, right? We said that we can observe brain activity, and it seems to correlate with certain experiences. When I feel happy, I can observe the brain from the outside using a scanner or other equipment, and I can see different type of activity happening in the brain, different neurons firing. Every time that I have this conscious experience. So there's a correlation between the brain activity and my conscious experience. Okay, so these were the 3 facts, and we want to try and explain them. So today what we'll do, I want to try and go through at a quick pace so that we cover a lot of ground, but there is a lot to discuss. So I'm going to touch on, hopefully if we have time, 3 viewpoints. Just like in part 1, part 2, I laid out different viewpoints, and each of us have to think about each of these viewpoints and see what we find to be convincing and the view that makes sense to us. Each of us has to do their own work and reach those conclusions. So I'm going to lay out the 3 main alternative views share some slides. This is where we finished last time. And so explaining these three facts and the three views that I'm going to cover, just to lay them out. The first is materialism, okay, which basically says that everything is just made out of matter. It's just matter, just different particles that are not conscious, and then everything comes out of matter. Okay, so that's materialism. Then there's a view called dualism, which says, no, mind is something different from matter, and they are both fundamental. They're both real. One does not create the other one. They are fundamental separately from each other, but they interact with each other somehow. So that's dualism. Okay, both of them are fundamental. And then the third view is called idealism. And that view says that actually it is mind or consciousness, which is what's fundamental. And actually matter comes from consciousness. So it's the exact opposite of the first one. Okay, opposite of materialism is idealism. Okay, so we'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail in today's session. So let's start with the first one, and that is materialism. Now, this is the most common view, I would say, in the world today, particularly in the West, and I would say most atheists, people who don't believe anything spiritual, they are just believe in the physical world, and they consider a scientific view of the world. They are materialists. Okay, so the West mostly follows this understanding of the world, and what it says is the only thing that really exists is matter. Okay, mad. So this is madi in Arabic, and the idea is that only thing that exists is matter, and matter is not conscious. Okay, there's no spirit in it, there's no awareness in it, it's just dead matter. Okay, and if you want to talk about it in physics terms, it's made of electrons and protons and these kind of particles, and that's the only thing there is. And then what happens is this matter becomes more and more complex in the way that it's organized, and gives rise to mind. Okay, so what is matter? Matter is conceived as a substance. It's a substance, okay, madda, independent and more fundamental than mind. Okay, and so the way in this world, a viewpoint, the way that we explain these three facts is we inhabit a world of matter outside of our minds. What's out there, outside of your mind, is just matter, right? That's why it's a shared world, because it's just matter out there, and anybody looking at it would see the same thing. Then number two, why can't we change the outside world through volition? Well, because it is totally separate and more fundamental than our minds, right? Our minds is this, as we'll see in a minute, our mind is this kind of almost like it's an illusion. It's not really real. Our minds are not really real. They're just illusion. But what's really real is matter. And that's why we cannot change what's out there. Matter is more fundamental. Mind is this kind of flaky, like a smoke in a way. It's not really concrete like matter. That's why we cannot change the world just by thinking about it. Okay, and the third claim is that mind, this is very important, okay? This view, which is, like I said, in the modern world, this is the most common view. Mind is generated by the brain. Okay, so you have brain, which is made out of matter, and then this complex, organism, the brain or organ, somehow causes this conscious experience to happen, causes it, right? So the brain fires and it makes consciousness happen. Okay, And it appears to be something real, but the mind is not actually real. It's only an illusion. The only thing that's there is actually matter. Okay, that is the kind of, I would say, most common view in the West, and more broadly as well, I think as well. Okay, so that's the view. Now, what are the problems with this viewpoint? Okay, this brings us to a topic which is a huge area of debate and discussion in the world today. If you go on the internet and you search for this stuff, you'll see it's a huge amount of discussion and active debate about this topic. And the way that it's kind of labeled is what you see here on my slide. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. Okay, the hard problem. This is a term that was developed by a philosopher called David Chalmers. He's based in New York University, and he's the one who kind of came up with this way of, summarizing the problem that materialism has. Okay, and what it is this. He says that there is nothing about the physical properties or the arrangements of particles that make up our brain in terms of which we could deduce, right, conclude the qualities of perception. Okay, what are the qualities of perception? Things such as what it feels like to fall in love, to look at a sunset, or taste an apple. These are the qualities of perception, of experience, right? So he's saying that there is nothing about the physical properties of matter, of particles, in terms of which we could get these qualities, right? Matter is defined as something which lacks all felt qualities, okay? So, if we think about electrons, okay, electrons don't have any experiences in them, right? That's what materialism says. There's no experience in electron. Electron doesn't have a color, doesn't have a taste, okay? Doesn't have a feeling to it. It doesn't feel, right? And so if the only thing we have in our brains is protons, electrons, neutrons, just organized in a certain way, there's no way for us to go from those particles to conscious experience, right? If the experiences are not in the particles, how is it going to arise? Just from a different arrangement of the particles, okay? And very important concept here, which we will go into here, is correlation and causation, okay? And the thing to remember is that correlation is not causation, all right? Now, I'll explain that in a moment. In fact, let me skip forward to that, okay? Because this is a very classic mistake that a lot of people make without really thinking carefully about it, okay? Because they say, look, the brain seems to have something to do with consciousness. It seems to cause, brain activity seems to cause conscious experiences to happen. But we have to be very strict about this. Correlation is not causation. Let me give you examples to really bring this out. It's going to sound very obvious, but it's important to remember because so many people make this mistake. So we start with causation. What do we mean by causation? This is in Arabic, it's al-aliyya, right? So you have a cause and an effect. So if you take some water and you heat it up, it's going to cause it to boil and you'll see steam coming out of the pot, right? There's a cause and effect here. There's causation. So when I see steam coming out, I can say, yes, it's being caused by the heat that causes the molecules to have higher energy, and that energy then makes them do a phase transition to become steam. So cause, right? Cause and effect. That's causation. But correlation is something different. And the example that I like here is ice cream and sunburn. Okay. Now, in summer, for example, what we will observe is that a lot of times ice cream sales go up. There's more people eating ice cream. Okay. And the number of people who get sunburn also goes up in the summer, right? Because of the sun and so on. So this is something we can observe. Every time we see that there is more ice cream sales, we also see there's more people who have sunburn. Yeah, two different phenomena, and they seem to behave in the same way. They go up in the summer and then they come down in after summer, right? That's what this graph is showing. When we get to the summer, more ice cream is consumed and more sunburn happens. Okay, and then both of them go down after the summer. Okay, this is correlation. Okay, this is not causation, right? Obviously, as we can all understand, having more ice cream doesn't cause you to have more sunburn, right? There's no causation there. They are correlated. They both, tend to happen at the same time. Maybe they happen every time in the same way. Exactly every summer we see more ice cream, and every summer we see more sunburn. Very tight correlation. Both go up and both come down at the same time. But one is not causing the other one. Yeah, it's just a correlation. And we can understand the reason why this happens is because of the sun and the behaviors that people go through because of the sun. People have more ice cream because it's hot. They go do sunbathing because it's hot, because of the summer, because of the sun. And that's why these things do happen. But the ice cream does not cause the sunburn, not causation, okay? And that's the key point that I'm making. Correlation doesn't always mean causation, okay? And so a lot of times when you talk to a materialist, they'll be like, yeah, but look at the brain. You see, every time the brain, I do something to the brain, you will have different experiences, right? So a lot of times you'll see they talk about how you can take like a very special magnet. It's like a piece of equipment that they use in neuroscience. And if you bring that magnet very close to the brain, so a certain part of the brain, you will lose the color in your vision. Everything will become gray, just from bringing a magnet next to your brain. Okay, and so people say, "Oh, look, I'm doing something to the brain, and it's causing your experience to change." So you see, it's all brain. It's all consciousness being created by the brain. But it's not, right? That is just two pieces of data. I changed the brain pattern, and there's a correlation with the conscious experience, but doesn't mean that the one has caused the other one to happen. Okay, for there to be cause, you have to show me how one is causing the other one to happen. And what I can tell you is, right now, we have zero scientific basis to say that it is caused. Okay, I can challenge anybody to disagree with this. Okay, I know this for a fact. Nobody believes that we actually have a theory, scientific theory, to prove that the brain activity is causing the conscious experience. All we have is this correlated result. We have this data. These brain activities correlate with these conscious experiences, okay? So this is important if you're talking to a materialist, to point out that correlation is not causation, okay? Now, if we continue, this is the hard problem of consciousness, that we have no way to explain how arrangements of matter cause conscious experiences. We don't, because these are two very different things. So that's one key point to take away. The other thing is that something to remember again, I've kind of hinted at it a couple of times, but again, let's remember, matter, when we say something is made of matter, we normally will say, oh, look, this pen is made of matter, right? It's made of a matter, of a substance like this. Let's remember, again, what I actually experience is the sight of this pen in my mind, right? I don't have access to the pen directly. I can only experience seeing an image of the pen. The pen itself is not going into my eyes, right? I see it with my mind. So what is primary is experience. Matter is an idea that we come up with. Maybe there's this stuff that's different to our minds, and it exists outside of our minds, and that's what this is, right? That's what's going on when we come up with the idea of matter. In our kind of scientific culture, we've kind of forgotten this, and we think that, yeah, it's obvious, there's this thing called matter, and it's outside of our minds. Well, that's not a fact, okay? That is what we call an explanatory abstraction, okay? And what does that mean? It means it's an abstraction, it's an idea, right? What I have is experience, but I form an idea that maybe there's this stuff outside of my mind that's not made of mind, it's made of something else. I'll call it matter, and that's what I'm seeing. You see, that is an abstraction. It's an idea. Oh, I can imagine there's this stuff outside of my mind, right? It's not made of mind, it's made of something else. And that's what's out there. That's what I'm seeing. Well, that's an abstraction. It's an idea. It's not a primary fact. Okay, it cannot be a fact because, again, I cannot know it outside of my mind. So there's no way for us to actually see matter. We will only ever see experience, and then we can come up with an idea if we want to try to explain why there's a shared world, all these things, using this idea, this abstraction called matter. Okay, so it's important to remember because there's no fact called matter. Okay, that's important. The third thing I say about materialism is that it's not parsimonious. Remember when we were saying, good philosophy means that we need to come up with the simplest theory we can to explain everything, right? We always want to try to have the simplest way of explaining things rather than having complications that are unnecessary, okay? So, and that's what we mean by parsimony. It's a simple explanation rather than an unnecessarily complex explanation, okay? And materialism is not parsimonious because it relies on this abstraction, right? It has to come up with this idea called matter, even though we never have experience of matter. It relies on matter and experience, right? So it's not parsimonious. There's this extra step you have to take to believe in matter, and that's an abstraction. Okay, and then what these materialists do is they say, actually, what's fundamental is that abstraction. Okay, so they replace the fundamental fact that we have for sure, which is experience. And then they say, no, that experience is what's an illusion, and what's real is this abstraction. This idea that we have that we call matter is what's real, and then what we experience is actually just an illusion. That's what materialism says. Okay, so these are the problems with materialism, and for anybody who gets into a debate with atheists or people who don't believe in any kind of existence beyond the physical world, These are the kind of things that we can be discussing with them. So we covered all of these, and I just summarized the key thing that we took away from it, right? Which was that brain activity is correlated to conscious experience. It does not cause conscious experience. And it's just something to really spend some time contemplating this, because I think most people think that there's a causation happening because they seem to kind of change together. It must be causation, but it's not. All we have is correlation. All right, let's move on. Viewpoint number 2 said is dualism. Now, this I think is a very kind of common sense type of a view. And in a way, it's a kind of a traditional view in religious circles. In traditional religious circles, I think you'll find it corresponds to dualism. And I think most people, most of you will probably think, yeah, this is the thing that makes sense, okay? So what does this say? Dualism says that both matter and mind are fundamental. Both are fundamental. When I say fundamental, it means that one does not depend on the other one. One does not create the other one. They are both independently fundamental. Okay, that's what I mean. And so in this view, it's a common sense view, which is that, yeah, the world outside is mostly made out of matter. So it recognizes that matter is fundamental. It's outside of our minds. That's why we see a shared world, because it's a world of matter that we are all operating within. And it also says, yeah, because it's matter out there, again, I can't change it with my mind just by thinking about it, because it's a different substance. It's not, the world is not made out of mind, it's made out of matter. But the third point is that mind is not generated by the brain, right? It's not just brain activity. It's fundamental. It's not being created by the brain. It kind of coexists with the brain. So there's brain and there's mind together, okay? And they interact with each other in the brain, but does not mean that, it's just matter and the mind comes later. No, it believes that they are equal to each other and they somehow interact with each other. Okay, so I think that's what most people probably, especially if you come from a more religious background, this is probably what your view is, that, yeah, I think that the world is made out of physical matter, but, we as human beings are, we have physical bodies, but we also have this kind of, mind or spirit, or whatever you want to call it, which is different. It's not matter. And when we die, for example, the body dies and the mind lives. There's life after death, right? So that's the traditional view. So what are the issues with this one? This one, you might say, well, what's the problem with that? These are two fundamental things, and we can understand the world based on these two things. So there's a couple of problems if you're, into kind of thinking about these things in philosophy. There's something called the interaction problem. Okay, because if you think about it, if you're telling me that there's matter and there's mind, and both of them are fundamental and they are completely different from each other, right? Mind is not made out of matter, it's made of something different, right? And then matter is the same, it's not the same as mind, it's separate, it's different. So if they're completely different from each other, how can they interact with each other, right? Mind can interact with mind, matter can interact with matter, but how would mind and matter interact with each other if they are made of completely different things, right? So this is called the interaction problem. How do they interact if they are totally different from each other, right? And then another way of saying that is that, we know from physics that we are able to explain pretty much everything about how matter works, based on the laws of physics, the same laws of physics that we discussed in part one. I can use those to explain what's going on. I don't see any kind of different force or different substance affecting anything that I study in physics, right? So physics is called a causally closed system. It's a technical word. It just means that, look, if there was something called mind at the fundamental level, we would see it affecting the electrons and the protons, but we don't. And we can explain everything about electrons and protons without anything extra called mind. Okay. So how at the fundamental level, how would these things interact in a way that I can't see it? How come I can't see, the effect of this mind on matter? I don't see it at the fundamental level. So this is called the interaction problem. And then again, when it comes to philosophy, we are looking for the simplest theory, right? That explains everything. And again, one of the key things that people in philosophy say, and even the people who follow this view of dualism, they say, look, it's not great. I have to, build my theory based on these two fundamental substances, right? It would be better if we could explain everything in terms of one underlying substance or reality, rather than more than one. It's just not as elegant as a theory or philosophy, because it relies on this idea of two fundamentals. Yeah, there's mind and there's matter. It's not as great. Now remember, the materialist was actually has a more simple theory. He says that there's only matter. The problem is we saw that it cannot explain everything. It cannot explain conscious experience, right? It cannot explain consciousness. So yeah, it's simple. There's only one substance, matter, okay, in materialism. But it's no good because you can't explain everything. You can't explain consciousness. In dualism, we can explain everything, right? We have matter, we explain how matter works. We have mind, and we say that it's fundamental, and we can explain that that's why we have consciousness, because there is something called mind. So it explains everything, but it's not simple. It's not parsimonious. It has these two fundamental substances in it. Okay, so hopefully you're following along with what I'm saying. This is kind of finding the strengths and the weaknesses of these different positions. And so, yeah, in summary, I would say, dualism is inferior. It's not as good as any kind of monism. Any theory which relies on just one fundamental reality, one substance, is called a monism. Okay, and dualism is not a monism. Monism is better if we are able to explain everything based on one substance. That would be the best outcome, right? And in my view, the third viewpoint does do that. This is the view that I defend. And this is a kind of consciousness-only view of the world, which is sometimes called idealism. Okay, now this is a very different way of looking at the world. So it might kind of sound really strange to you when you hear it for the first time. So let me kind of take you guys through it, and then really needs a lot of time for you to kind of think about these different views and see what makes sense to you. So with idealism, we start, as I hinted at before, we start with experience. We don't start with this idea that we come up with called matter. No, we start with what we do know as a fact, and that is that I'm having experience. That's what we know as a fundamental fact that nobody would disagree with, okay? So experience, i.e. mind, is the most direct fact that we have access to, right? And so I make that my starting point. Then we say that I'm going to explain everything in terms of conscious experience without introducing any other substance, right? I'm not going to introduce some idea of something called matter that I can never know directly. I'm just going to try to explain everything in terms of consciousness, okay? And so how does it work? Well, the claim is this: there's only consciousness, and everything is a pattern of excitation, of change and movement in this kind of field of consciousness. So just think of everything out there. The entire universe is like a field of consciousness, like a universal mind, okay? And everything in this universe is a pattern of change and excitation of that field of consciousness, okay? And in this view, then how do I explain, what is this thing we call matter? Well, matter is what that consciousness looks like from a particular perspective, from the outside. So there are two perspectives that we can know. Just think about yourself. You have an internal perspective, right? When you look within yourself in your mind, you have your conscious experience. And then when you look outside, even your own body, when you look at it from the outside, you see matter, okay? Or you see your face, you see your brain. That's matter. So matter is what consciousness looks like. It's the image of consciousness from an external perspective. So if I'm looking at Jassim on my screen, I see him from the outside, right? I'm looking at his body from the outside. I see a physical body, or let's say I'm scanning his brain using a brain scanner. I see his brain, I see matter, and I see activity in his brain from the outside. But Jassim from the inside is experiencing. He doesn't have matter, he has experience on the inside. Yeah. So what he's experiencing as happiness or sadness, that's the conscious experience from the internal perspective. And then, the brain scan pictures that I showed in the slide, that's what it looks like from the outside. It's just matter is what consciousness looks like from the outside. Okay, that's the view being explained here. So matter is the extrinsic meaning from the external point of view of the appearance of consciousness. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, how does it explain the three facts? Well, now it's kind of a different, very different view of the world. It's saying that there is a world out there, okay, and that's why we have a common shared world. There is a world outside of my mind, outside of my personal consciousness, but it is also made of consciousness. Okay? It's made of consciousness. It is within consciousness as a whole, not my personal consciousness, but a kind of universal consciousness. Okay, so a universal field of consciousness is what we inhabit, and that's why we see the same world, because we are inhabiting a real world out there, but that world is not made of matter, it's made out of consciousness. Okay, so that's how it explains this shared world. Now, we can't change the outside world through our volition because we have individual minds, and then there's a universal mind out there. Okay, I can change things in my personal mind. I cannot change what's out there because I'm not that universal mind. Okay, I'm dissociated, I'm separated. There's a boundary between my personal consciousness, my personal mind, and this universal mind. There is I'm going to explain this word, there's a dissociation. There's a kind of boundary between them. But that's why I can't change the outside world just by thinking about it, because I have a personal mind. I am not the universal mind. Okay. And the third fact is that mind is not generated by the brain. Brain activity is simply what conscious experience looks like from an external perspective, right? So that's why they are correlated. Because guess what? A thing and the image of that thing are correlated. They look the same as each other. They will behave in the same way. One is the image of the other. Okay? Brain activity is the image of conscious experience. It's what experience looks like. That's why they are correlated. But the image does not cause the thing itself, right? The image is just it's what it looks like. It's not creating the thing itself, right? So that's the way that these three facts of experience are explained in this framework. Now, in order to I'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but the main problem or the thing that that this view of the world has to explain is, well, okay, if everything is made out of mind, how come I don't know your thoughts, right? How come you don't know my thoughts? How come I don't know the thoughts of the universal mind, right? If it's all made out of mind, how is it that you have these individual minds and they are not able to, sort of see into each other or experience what the other minds are experiencing, right? I have my experiences, you have your experiences, and they are different from each other, right? So then how is this explained if everything is made out of mind, right? So this is called the decomposition problem. How do individual minds arise? How are they kind of separated from each other if everything is made of mind? How come they don't share their experiences? Okay, so that's the big question for idealism. And so a lot of people have thought about this problem and proposed different ways of trying to say, well, this is how we could try to understand how that could happen. Okay. And so one of them is this theory of dissociation. Okay, and for this I'm using material from a philosopher called Bernardo Castro. He's a philosopher from Holland who I have a lot of respect for, and he's developed this way of trying to understand and explain this view. So he says, look, there is one universal mind, okay, one universal field of consciousness, and what happens is that field goes through a kind of dissociation process, okay, where an individual mind arises. Think of it as like almost like a bubble. You can see it in this kind of diagram. This is a bubble forms within this universal consciousness. Each one of these bubbles is an individual mind. He calls them alters, which means alternative, like an alternative mind or an alternative personality. And there's a couple of ways to try and understand what this could be like, okay? And how do we have any kind of evidence that something like this could work? One analogy is the dream, okay? Because if you think about it, every night when you dream, you experience yourself in a dream world, right? There's a world, there's a dream world, and you are in that dream world, okay? And just so that's what happens. But as we know, the whole dream is happening in your mind, in a single mind. So your mind kind of splits into two parts. There's a part that represents you in the dream, and there's another part that represents the world that you're in, right? So our mind actually dissociates in the dream into your dream avatar, your dream body, okay, in the dream, and the dream world and everything that's in it, right? One mind is splitting into parts, right? That's what's happening in the dream. Now, note that, there's, I say it's splitting, but it's really just an appearance, right? The mind itself is just one mind, but it just goes through this kind of strange process where it kind of it appears to separate itself into individual parts. Okay, so something like that can be a way to try to understand how you could have a universal mind and then still have individual minds within it. Okay, so that's one analogy. The other analogy is actually a medical condition called dissociative identity disorder. I think a lot of people know it as multiple personality disorder, right? So this is some people kind of go through a medical condition where they have more than one personality, like separate real personalities, and these different personalities take control of the body at different times. So this person literally becomes more than one person. Okay, it's a real condition. It is recognized in psychiatry. And so what's happening is that this single mind is actually fragmenting into multiple minds, multiple personalities. So this is a way to try and think about how you could have a reality which is only consciousness, be able to explain everything, these three facts of experience, and then be able to explain how is it that individual minds can exist in that system. Very interesting, and it has a kind of a natural fit, in my opinion, with everything that we've been talking about, actually, in terms of this understanding of God as being infinite self-aware being. Well, we also said that it's infinite, there's no boundaries in it, and it is conscious, it is self-aware, right? That's the way that we understood God. And so if we build on that idea, this is where I think we get to. We said that God is infinite, self-aware being. Now, another way of saying that, right? So this is what we covered in part 3, right? I laid out this view that think of God as infinite being, al-wujud al-mutlaq, right? But this being that we talk about, being is itself conscious. It's not like a dead being just exists. No, it is a conscious being, or being itself is consciousness. It is self-aware. Okay. Another way of saying the same thing is that God is infinite consciousness. Okay. This consciousness exists. It is infinite, but it is conscious as well. So it's saying the same thing, but now from this perspective, because we're now talking about consciousness and the nature of mind and the nature of experience, we can express the same understanding of God, which we said was, focused on wujud, on being. Now we express it in terms of consciousness. And in the kind of traditional view, or not traditional view, but in the religious expression of that, I connect that with this the divine name, Al-Hayy. Okay, Al-Hayy, which in the traditional texts is explained, or if you want to say, what does Al-Hayy mean? They say it is Ad-Darrak Al-Fa'al, okay? The aware that has the capacity to act, to do. And so Al-Hayy really focuses on this idrak, it's this consciousness, this awareness. And it is the most primary of all of God's names. Okay, so the name Allah is the most comprehensive. Under that, Al-Hayy is considered to be al-Asma. It's the mother of all the other names. Everything else derives from this Al-Hayy. That's why in so many places in the Quran, he says, Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa huwa al-Hayy. Al-Qayyum. It always starts with this name. Um, and it's because it's considered the primary name of Allah, under this comprehensive name, Allah. And I personally interpret it as consciousness. This is because what does Hayy means here? It means the living one. But what does living mean? Right? What does it mean? It doesn't mean, is a living organism, that has life like we do. It is because he is alive. To be alive means to be conscious and to be able to act. Right? So it's that conscious nature that is being pointed at through the name Al-Hayy. And so I understand that as, that we said God has no limits, no boundaries, right? We spent a lot of time talking about that when we were talking about God's being. Well, the same applies to God's consciousness. God is aware, of course. That's what Al-Hayy is telling you. It's not just a kind of blind principle. It's not just being. He's conscious, aware. And that consciousness has no limits, no boundaries, just like its being. His being had no boundaries, and that consciousness is the nature of his being. And so his consciousness also has no limits and no boundaries. And so this, if you think about it this way, I think it's the most natural way to then extend that and say, well, that's what everything that appears. We said everything that appears is an appearance of that being, right? It's a manifestation of that being. Well, the whole universe essentially is arising in that being, is appearing in that being. It is all made of consciousness. It's made of being. Another word for that is it's made of consciousness. And we don't need to refer to something fundamentally different called matter at all, because nothing is outside of that consciousness for it to be made of something different from consciousness. Okay. And then from the next session, inshallah, we'll talk then about ourselves as well, the spirit, ruh, that is in us, and what its connection is to the whole. But essentially, I summarize some of it here, which is that this, what we are, our personal consciousness, is also made of that pure being consciousness, because its source is God's consciousness. So we are not minds, we are not bodies, we are pure consciousness. That's what we're actually made of. And we are directly connected to God in that way. This is a beautiful hadith where it says in روح المؤمن لأشد اتصالا بروح الله من اتصال شعاع الشمس بها. So we are connected to God in the most intense way, more intense or more direct than the rays of light are to the sun. And I think this is what we'll develop, is this way of looking at it as a pure conscious, infinite consciousness, and then these individual consciousnesses within that field of infinite consciousness. Okay, and we'll go into these characteristics of the ruh. Its unchanging nature, its boundaryless nature. These things will come later. I just thought I would summarize them here. But that's the kind of overall picture I wanted to paint of these different viewpoints about consciousness. We have materialism. You see, dualism then becomes a much messier way of trying to explain things. There's matter and there's mind, and then how do those relate to God? This is a much cleaner way of understanding things. Everything is actually ultimately made of consciousness. God is infinite consciousness, just as we established that he is infinite being. And then everything is a manifestation of that field of consciousness, field of being. All right, with that, I think we'll stop there for today. and then go into any discussions. And then from the next session, we will start to explore all of these ideas experientially ourselves. So far, we started with the scientific part, right? We looked at the brain and what science can tell us. And then we've now explored the philosophical questions around consciousness and mind, and we looked at these different viewpoints, and we saw that there's this viewpoint which can understand reality as all being within consciousness. Actually, I think I have a summary of these here, so let me just list this up. I think I've covered it all, but just for completeness. So we said that experience is more fundamental than the abstract concept of matter. That's an important point. There's no proof that brain activity causes conscious experience. I make a point of highlighting this because, as I said, the most common view out there is that it does, and it's just simply wrong. The third thing we said is that we can explain everything based on consciousness and experience alone. We don't need to introduce the idea of this thing called matter. We can basically think about the world as all existing within this infinite field of consciousness. And then we can relate to all things as being made of the same fundamental substance. You see, this becomes part of the beauty of this way of seeing things, because no longer will you treat things as, oh, this is made of matter. It's not the same as me or, my loved ones. We treat the planet like it's made of something else. We all claim we love the planet, but we don't behave towards it as though it is made of consciousness like we are, you see. When you introduce two substances, you create this separation and this difference in the way that we behave towards different things. When you see this way of looking at things, honestly, you will change the way that you interact with the world. Everything, even a stone, a rock, will take on a different significance because it's not made of something different from you. It is all made of consciousness, all made of one fundamental substance. It's a beautiful way of seeing things, that it will really change. And this starts to allow you to see the oneness in everything much more deeply, because now you've understood it's not made of different substances. Just like we said, its being has one underlying being that is infinite and is common to everything. All of us share the same being, yes? But even going beyond that, the way that we see things, they may look like different substances, but in fact, they are all made of the same one consciousness, one substance. So this starts to help to improve our understanding in a way that we'll be able to see oneness in everything. Okay, and so the way to summarize the whole thing is to say that consciousness is not in the universe. The universe is in consciousness. You see, normally we think there's a universe out there, and then there's consciousness in me and you, not in everything, just me and you, within this huge thing called this material universe. This looks at it the other way around. The whole thing is in infinite consciousness. All right, I'll stop there. Thank you.